Hello guys, here's a kind of boss enemy, or more like a mini boss I guess, that I recently implemented in my exploration and discovery focused game Crater Company, which I am building right now with the Godot Engine. In this video I will go over its implementation in a pretty fast-paced manner. The idea for this enemy originates from the need to have some sort of barrier the player can only overcome after having obtained a key item. In this case, the key item is a shield. I hope that most of you have played The Legend of Zelda: A Link's Awakening. I bring that game up because it actually has a very similar passage, where you can only progress to the 8th dungeon after having obtained the mirror shield from the 7th. That is, of course, unless you know speedrunning strats. So I needed to do something similar, but instead of just implementing a flamethrower that knocks you back, it turned into some sort of ginormous centipede monster, half of which is buried under the ground. And that is primarily because the setting this takes place in is a forest teeming with all sorts of insects. So here's what happens when the player reaches this place without having obtained the shield yet. As you can see, those constantly moving centipede legs that are sticking out of the ground there are repelling the player, so there's no way to progress here. Only after having obtained the shield, the player can push through those legs. But it's not over after having made it to the other side, as here's where the main body of the centipede comes out of the ground and blocks the way yet again. This monster is static, as in it doesn't move. Instead, it attacks by shooting projectiles at you, which are some sort of poisonous balls, I guess. So we will have to create those projectiles while simultaneously attempt to deal damage to the monster. Also, as the health of the monster goes down, the attack patterns change and become increasingly more difficult to evade. Here's where I want to point out that in this game you cannot simply tank damage. If you're not careful, you die quickly. So you really need to take evading those attacks seriously. Alright now, so let's finish the fight. Great, we made it, the monster went down and reveals behind it a passage where we can continue to progress in the game. Now let's have a quick look at some of how this is implemented. First of all, of course I needed to draw the sprites. For this I use Sprite, which is a great image editor that leaves nothing to be desired in terms of pixel art. Keep in mind that even though I'm an absolute sucker for pixel art, it is absolutely not my focus or strength, and so all of the assets here are to be seen as prototype and placeholder assets for the time being. Here you can see how I started drawing the segment with the legs in primitive shapes. I then drew 11 frames of those crawling lines to create an animation. After that I went over all the frames and legs one by one and used the eraser tool to make them sharp. I also used the gradient tool to apply a color gradient to them. Here's what the resulting sprite sheet looks like. This is by far the most complex sprite used for the enemy, as almost all other sprites are just a single frame and animated in-game primarily by means of rotation. Alright, now let's boot up the Godot editor and have a look at the relevant scenes and a quick dive into the code as well. Okay, so here we see the entire enemy in this forest scene. Those 3 assets are placeholders as well that quickly whipped up. So yeah, as you can see, the idea was that this is basically this huge centipede that is basically on its back buried into the ground with its legs to the top, and this segment here is preventing the player from progressing without the shield. And here is this little fight taking place in this area. Here, yeah, and this entire thing, or at least the upper part, is also its own scene, which we can see here. And down here we see this barrier. So it's basically just 2 nodes. It's a animated sprite with those 11 sprites I talked about earlier, as well as a area 2D with a collision shape. The top part here is a little bit more complex. There's a variety of nodes that are used in this die animation, which is a kind of complex animation. A lot of moving parts that is played when the enemy is defeated, which is this one. Yeah. It basically pops open and just splatters everywhere. But yeah, really the interesting part is the script. It's 130 lines. Yeah, and pretty much all of the logic takes place in the process function. First, there's a little segment for selects. Basically, there's an interval at which selects check for overlapping bodies, and if the player is overlapping, a take hit method is called on the player object with a vector here that is basically the strength of the knockback, and it's a vector 2 down, so this is going to knock the player downwards on the screen. So in essence, this makes it impossible for the player to walk through this legs segment. Oh yeah, and how this entire thing with the shield works. The take hit method on the player is called here. Let's have a quick look at that one as well. It's sitting here. First thing in take hit is to check if a shield is equipped and actually held up right now. And then here the shield has its own take hit function. Don't really need to look into this one, but just basically is some mass that reduces the damage. And in terms of selects damage, which is 0.1, it's completely nullified. The shield is strong enough, so there's no damage coming through. And here then this impact vector is set to 0, which is to say that there is no longer going to be any knockback occurring. So this is the entire shield mechanic. As on the head of the centipede monster, this line makes it so that the head of the centipede always looks at the player, and there's a lerp function here, so it's not instantaneous the rotation, but if the player moves quickly, then the centipede sort of slowly moves its head to face the player again. And then at a certain cooldown again, the centipede begins to cast its attack. So there's this green orb appearing in front of the centipede's mouth, and after a certain cast time, it is shot and the projectile flies towards the player. And there's a bunch of variables here. In total there are 4 variables I can use to tune the difficulty of the enemy. First of all is attack cooldown. This is interval at which the enemy will shoot its projectiles. And this is a shot count. It begins at 1. This is just the amount of projectile it shoots. The cast time. So you may have noticed that there is a red line appearing whenever an enemy attacks. This is an indication showing the player there's going to be an attack here at this location. If you're going to keep staying in this red line, you're going to get hit, so see to it that you move away. And the cast time here is basically the time between this attack indication and when the projectile actually is fired towards the player. And then the shot speed is the speed at which the projectile flies. So faster projectiles are obviously harder to avoid because you need to react quicker. And there are basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages where every 20% of damage that you deal to the enemy, it becomes more difficult. So it's, for example, it starts with 1 shot, then 3, 5, 7. In its final stage, it goes back to only 1 shot. However, with a very short attack cooldown, a very short cast time, and a very high speed. So this is where it just continuously shoots at you and you constantly need to keep moving and evading and somehow simultaneously try to get a hit in. Here's the logic that spawns the projectiles. The projectiles are in its own scene, preloaded here and then instanced for the amount of shot count. And here's a code that spreads the projectiles evenly. So you probably have noticed that there's always an even distance between each projectile. So we can also have a little look into the shot scene here. So here in the shot script, there is this damage, this red damage indicator animation, and as well as this trail effect is being set up. And of course, then there's a callback function for the event where a shot hits something. If it's a player, we call the take hit method on the player with a attack value that has been passed by the enemy to this projectile, as well as an knockback vector. Yup. Alright, so that's it for this video. Even though this game is still in early development and there's a ton of polish here to be done, I am pretty happy with how this enemy turned out. What do you think? Feedback is always highly appreciated. If you want to learn more about the project and keep up with its development, consider subscribing and following on the various social media platforms. However, probably the easiest way to get a nice overview of the game, its state and my representation online is to visit its website, crater.company. See you around!